Hi everybody, welcome back, glad you could tune in again. Okay, let's take a look at the book of Titus. What I want to do is just to give you a brief overview of the setting in which the book was written, a sense of the book as a whole, the overall themes of it, and then I'll point you to one or two details which you may find interesting and instructive as you're digging into this book and trying to get to grips with it a little bit more. First, the setting of the book is summarized in chapter 1 verse 5. Paul explains to his friend Titus, a minister and co-worker with Paul, quote, chapter 1 verse 5, "This is why I left you in Crete, so that you might put what remained into order and appoint elders in every town as I directed you." So you get there a picture of what's happened. Crete, a large island in the Mediterranean. Paul had left Titus there during one of his missionary journeys after Paul had moved on. Titus got the job of appointing elders in all the towns and in all the churches in those towns. And you get the impression why that's so important if you read on later in chapter 1, because you discover what kind of a place Crete was. Paul quotes a pagan poet in chapter 1 verse 12 famously. I'll read it to you. He says, "One of the Cretans, a prophet of their own, said, quote, 'Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons.'" And Paul appears to endorse this verdict on the island of Crete, having been there himself. "This testimony is true," he says. And so it's all the more important in that kind of context to have elders and teachers and ministers appointed in every town to guide the church on the narrow path of the truth and steer it clear of the waywardness of the teaching that they're finding and they're hearing all around them. That false teaching which is all around them is highlighted in chapter 1 verse 10. Paul says there are many who are insubordinate, empty talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision party, apparently alluding to some old covenant Jewish teaching which ought to have been fulfilled, has been fulfilled rather, and ought to have been moved on from in the church because of the fulfillment of all those old covenant teachings in Christ. But there are some who are clinging to it or clinging to distorted versions of it and keep banging on about it in the churches and so on. Now, just on to some of the details here, you notice one or two surprises. You'd think, for example, still in chapter 1, that in view of that false teaching which is all around the congregations in Crete, Paul would be encouraging Titus to rebuke the false teachers and tell them to keep quiet. And indeed elsewhere he does, but here his attention appears to be directed elsewhere. Let me just read from chapter 1 verse 13, the second half of the verse. "Therefore rebuke them sharply, that they may be sound in the faith, not devoting themselves to Jewish myths and the commands of people who turn away from the truth." And just look at that for a second. It doesn't look like Paul is rebuking or urging Titus to rebuke the people who are peddling the Jewish myths and peddling those commands. He's urging Titus to rebuke the people who are listening to them. It's just worth thinking about, isn't it? In practical terms, this is really incisive. How often it is that you've got someone like Paul or Titus in a church or with responsibility for a church, and he sees all these ungodly and misplaced and ignorant teachings pouring into the hearts and minds of the congregation from outside. And Paul would love to grab those teachers outside the congregation by the scruff of the neck and give them a piece of his mind, but they've made themselves completely unaccountable to him. And they won't listen to him. They're not interested in paying attention to the rebukes of the apostle. The only people whom Paul and Titus have the ear of, the only people they could speak to, are the people in the congregation. And so Paul actually says to Titus, you need to rebuke them sharply, those folks in the congregation. And it's really pertinent and intriguing today, isn't it? You can easily see how any church, our church or any other church, however godly and well-intentioned its members are, and however sound its teaching has been for however many years, there's all kinds of influences from outside the church, weird and wonderful teaching and very strange and unbiblical teaching masquerading as Christian teaching, which is likely to influence the congregation unless the congregation is switched on enough to filter out the garbage and keep close to the truth. And so there comes a point where every congregation needs to take responsibility for what it is hearing, just as every teacher needs to take responsibility for what he's teaching. And while I don't think a rebuke is necessarily in order in every circumstance, nonetheless a warning perhaps is. We all need, every member of the congregation needs to watch what you're listening to, especially in an age such as ours, where with the advent of blogs and the internet and social media in particular, there's all kinds of rubbish which is all too easily available, which you could be sucked in by if you're not careful. So don't pay attention to it. That's what Paul would have Titus tell you, and that's what I urge you to be thinking about as well. Just one other feature of the book of Titus which is worth noting, I think, as you're reading through it. Many commentators have noticed how many lists Paul includes in this letter to Titus. And often the temptation, if you're like me, the temptation when you're reading the Bible and you come to a long list of character traits or something, whether they're character traits required of elders or of a certain kind of people or whatever, is you sort of skim through the list, getting a general flavour of what it's about, but not meditating on the specific details of it. Well, I do think that's a mistake, and it's a missed opportunity, because here we've got the opportunity to think long and hard and deeply about the specific character traits which are required of particular individual people if they're to grow in maturity in Christ. And in Titus you've got all kinds of specific lists directed at specific people. So just at the beginning of chapter 2, for example, verse 2, older men. Verse 3, older women. Scan down a little bit further, you've got younger men a little bit later on in chapter 2, and then the younger women are addressed as well. Well, that pretty much covers everybody, and it'd be worth thinking about, wouldn't it? Just figure out which category or categories you fit into if you think you're on the sort of borders between younger and older. And older men, for example, just meditate for a few minutes on the character traits of being sober-minded, dignified, self-controlled, sound in faith, in love, and in steadfastness. Don't just let those flit past your gaze, but reflect on and pray through those, and you may find it instructive and encouraging, and perhaps even a rebuke or two nestled away in there for you as you do that. That at least is some of the things you may find interesting and helpful as you're looking through the book of Titus. I hope you do. The Lord bless you, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye for now.